She lost everything in a single night. Her village burned, her daughter taken. Banished and alone, Seren swore she'd cross any abyss to get her child back. But the Drexel aren't just raiders. They're experimenting with ancient technology, turning children into weapons. What happens when a warrior driven by guilt meets a man who holds the key to stopping them? Seren smelled the smoke long before she saw it. The scent carried on the wind like a warning she'd ignored too long. She broke into a run, her patrol route forgotten, her lungs burning from more than exertion. When she crested the ridge, her village was already a funeral pyre. Flames clawed at the sky from what had been homes, storehouses, the meeting hall. There was no chaos, no frantic movement, just the slow, hungry consumption of everything she knew. She moved through the ruins with her sword drawn, stepping over charred timber and the blackened shapes that used to be neighbors. The Drexel hadn't come to plunder. They hadn't even come to kill. They came to extract. Every child under 12 was gone. Not a single young face among the dead. The silence was more brutal than any battle cry. She found the body of Kalen near the eastern gate, still gripping his spear. He'd put 3 Drexel down before they took him. It hadn't mattered. Her own home stood half collapsed, the door torn from its hinges. Inside, her daughter's room was a ruin of overturned furniture and scattered belongings. The small bed was empty, the blankets dragged onto the floor. A child's carved wooden horse lay broken near the doorway. On the wall, a single deep gash marked where a blade had struck stone. This was no random act of destruction. They knew which room to hit. They knew who they wanted. Elder Tavik found her there, his face streaked with soot and fury. He didn't speak of the Drexel's precision, their numbers, their technology. He spoke only of her failure to be there. His words were cold and final. Banishment for abandoning her post, for leaving the village unprotected. She didn't argue. There was no point. The truth was a weight she already carried. She left with the clothes she wore, her sword, and a small silver pendant that held a lock of her daughter's hair. Nothing else mattered. As she walked away from the smoldering wreckage, she made a vow to herself. She would cross deserts, oceans, star systems if she had to. She would walk into any hell they had built. She would find her child or die trying. The road ahead was empty. No companions, no supplies, no hope of help, just the relentless echo of what she'd lost. Every step was a reminder. Every breath was a debt unpaid. Her isolation was complete, a circle drawn around her by grief and guilt. She would learn to move like a shadow, to fight like something they hadn't anticipated. She would become a story they told their children to scare them. But first she had to survive. Alone. Kalen moved through the Vantrax facility with practiced silence. His contract was clear. Observe and report on their newest acquisitions, nothing more. Get in, catalog the high-value assets, get out. No retrieval, no confrontation. The pay was good enough to ignore the unease that crept up his spine in these corporate strongholds. The air here smelled sterile, like chemicals and filtered oxygen. But underneath it all lingered something else. Something old. The containment wing held specimens that defied classification. Things in tanks that pulsed with inner light. Weapons that hummed with dormant energy. Artifacts that seemed to watch him as he passed. He noted them all with a detached professionalism. Then he saw specimen S-378. It rested on a pedestal behind 3 layers of energy shielding. A sword, but unlike any he'd ever seen. Its blade was dark, almost liquid, and along its length ran veins of soft blue light that seemed to breathe. As he approached, the security protocols ignited without warning. Harsh white lights flooded the chamber. A synthetic voice announced a breach. But the containment fields around the sword didn't strengthen. They flickered and died. The weapon rose from its pedestal on its own, drifting toward him as if pulled by an invisible thread. Kalen reached out, not quite believing what he was doing. His fingers closed around the hilt. It felt cold at first, then warm. A single word echoed in his mind, clear and unmistakable. Salvation. Around him, corporate security teams poured into the room. They didn't shout threats or demand he drop the weapon. They chanted low and rhythmic like a prayer. Their faces were grim, focused. This wasn't about protecting property. It was about guarding something holy. The moment his skin made contact, the world shifted. Visions flooded his senses. Star charts of unknown sectors. Schematics for machines that bent reality. Languages he'd never heard spoken. He saw civilizations rise and fall. technologies lost to time and woven through it all, the same blue light that now coursed through the sword. This was no mere weapon. It was a key. A guide. He understood then that his mission had just been rewritten. He wasn't holding a corporate asset. He was holding a purpose. The security teams advanced, their weapons raised, but the sword seemed to anticipate their movements. It hummed in his grip, pulling him toward an exit he hadn't noticed before. He moved without thinking, parrying stun bolts with effortless precision, his body responding to the blade's subtle directions. He broke into a run, the sword leading him through service corridors and emergency shafts. Alarms blared, but their sound grew distant behind him. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from fear but from the shock of revelation. He had walked into Vantrax a hired observer. He was leaving as something else entirely. His escape craft was waiting where he'd hidden it, a small, fast vessel built for stealth, not combat. He launched without clearance, slicing through the corporation's defensive perimeter with ease, the sword's energy disrupting their tracking systems. As he broke into open space, he input no coordinates. Instead, he let the blade's presence in his mind suggest a direction. A blue star in a remote sector. A world called Shaolanka. He didn't know it yet, but his path had already intersected with another's. A warrior, alone in her suffering, moving toward the same destination. Their hells were about to meet. The sword didn't feel like technology in Kalen's hand, it felt like a presence. Not a tool to be wielded, but something aware. It hummed softly, a vibration that traveled up his arm and settled deep in his bones. He'd handled enough high-grade corporate weaponry to know the difference. This was something else entirely. Back in the Vantrax facility, he'd seen security teams try to use it. Their hands slipped from the hilt. The blade went dark and heavy in their grip like dead weight. But for him, it responded. It anticipated. When he thought to block, it was already moving. When he needed to cut through a bulkhead, it showed him exactly where to strike. The energy fields parted for it like mist. It wasn't obeying him. It was cooperating. The visions came without warning. Flashes of Drexel armor, their distinctive angular design, their weapons that fired concentrated plasma, then images of Vantrax laboratories, clean, sterile places where similar technology was being reverse-engineered. The connections formed in his mind like circuit paths lighting up. The corporations weren't just rivals. They were working from the same ancient blueprint. The sword showed him laboratories where living subjects were fused with machinery, where children were strapped to tables while technicians monitored their vital signs. The same blue energy that ran through the blade pulsed in those machines. Its guidance grew more specific in the days that followed. A star chart burned behind his eyes during sleep. A particular sector, a single planet, Shaolanka. The name echoed in his thoughts like something remembered from a dream. He tried to plot other courses to deviate to test the sword's influence. Each time systems would glitch. Navigation relays would fail. The sword pulled like a magnet, subtle but unyielding. He realized the truth during a routine systems check. He wasn't steering the ship. The sword was. His hands on the controls were just a formality. The realization should have frightened him. Instead, it brought a strange calm. He was no longer a thief running from a corporate contract. He was being directed, chosen. When the Meridian's engines failed without warning, he didn't panic. Alarms blared across the cockpit. Atmosphere vented from a cracked seal. The ship shuddered as it hit Shaolanka's upper atmosphere, heat shields glowing red. He gripped the sword's hilt tighter. It hummed steadily in response, a calm center in the chaos. This wasn't a malfunction. It was an arrival. The impact tore through the ship's frame. Metal screamed. Kalen was thrown against his restraints. Through the cracked viewport, he saw alien trees rushing up to meet him, tall, blue-leaved, and strange. The ship came to rest in a gorge, half buried in crystal-tinged soil. Silence fell, broken only by the hiss of cooling metal. He unbuckled himself, the sword still in hand. It felt lighter now, purposeful. He had walked into Vantrax a hired hand. He had left a fugitive. Now he was something else entirely, a participant in a story much older than himself. The sword had not chosen randomly. It had chosen him for a reason he didn't yet understand, but would have to trust. His old life was gone. His new one was just beginning on a world he was never meant to find. Saren saw the wreckage from a ridge, a ship not Drexel design. Corporate, maybe, Fresh impact, smoke still rising from ruptured engines. She approached low, using the blue ferns for cover. Her hand rested on her sword. Another intruder. Another threat. She would not let this one alert the patrols. She would end it quietly. He was crouched by the open cockpit, pulling a damaged unit free. His back was to her. His gear was corporate cut but worn, not standard issue. It didn't matter. He was here. That was enough. She pushed from the ferns, her blade slicing the air toward his shoulder. A disabling strike. Not a kill. Not yet. He moved faster than she expected. He dropped, rolled, came up with a weapon in hand. Not a blaster, a sword. Their blades met with a sharp ring of metal. The impact vibrated up her arm. His eyes widened, but he didn't speak. He just adjusted his grip, his stance fluid, ready. They circled. Her style was all economy of motion. Precise cuts, defensive parries, the disciplined form of a trained warrior. His was different, reactive, adaptive. He moved like someone who had learned to fight in back alleys and starport docks, not a training yard. He used his environment, putting the wreckage between them, using a low-hanging branch to deflect her lunge. He was good, but she was better. Then his blade changed. The dark metal began to glow with a soft blue light, veins of energy pulsing along its length. It hummed, a low sound that felt ancient. She hesitated. That was not corporate tech. That was something else, something she had seen in the oldest stories of her people, a weapon of legend, a thing of power. The hum of repulsor engines cut the moment short. 3 Drexel warriors dropped from the trees, their plasma rifles already aimed. No challenges, no demands. They fired. Seren and the stranger moved at the same instant. She deflected a shot meant for his head. He parried one aiming for her back. They found themselves standing shoulder to shoulder, a circle of hostile energy closing around them. Their coordination was unspoken, instinctive. He covered high attacks. She took the low. When he lunged forward to draw fire, she flanked. When she engaged one directly, he disabled another with a sharp kick to its weapon arm. They moved like 2 parts of a single mechanism, their styles dovetailing out of sheer necessity. The Drexel fell back, surprised by the resistance. Between parries, her voice was sharp. "Who are you?" "Not with them," he grunted, blocking a plasma burst. The blue sword absorbed the energy, flaring brighter. "Corporate?" she demanded, driving her blade into a joint of Drexel armor. "Not anymore." He disarmed a warrior with a flick of his wrist. The strange sword seemed to guide his hand. "I'm no friend to these creatures." The last Drexel fell. Silence returned to the small clearing, broken by their breathing. They stood amid the fallen enemy, weapons still held ready. They watched each other. The immediate threat was gone. The larger one remained. He was an unknown, a variable, but he fought the Drexel, and he held a weapon that defied explanation. It was not trust. It was calculation, a temporary alliance, a shared direction. The citadel still loomed in the distance. The enemy was numerous. Alone, they would likely fail. Together, they had a chance. It was a practical decision, born of survival, not camaraderie. The road ahead was still hell, but now they would walk it side by side, for now. The ground trembled, not from another Drexel patrol. This was deeper, older. The soil near the ancient ruins shifted, stones rearranging themselves like puzzle pieces sliding into place. A sentinel carved from obsidian and silver rose from the earth, its form humanoid but utterly alien. It stood twice Kalen's height, with no visible eyes, only smooth plains of stone that caught the light. It moved with a silent purpose that felt ancient. A second one emerged nearby, then a third. They ignored the fallen Drexel. They turned toward Kalen, toward the sword. The blade in his hand flared, its blue light intensifying. The sentinels responded in kind, their stone surfaces glowing with the same energy. They weren't attacking. They were answering a call. But their answer was not friendly. They advanced, their movements smooth and unnervingly fast for things made of stone. One swung an arm that was not an arm but a solid beam of polished rock. Kalen barely dodged. The impact cratered the ground where he'd been standing. Serene didn't hesitate. Her blade met the next attack, deflecting it with a shower of sparks. The force of the blow numbed her arm to the shoulder. This was not a fight they could win. These things were not organic. They did not tire. They did not feel pain. A silent understanding passed between her and Kalen. They broke and ran. The forest became a blur. The sentinels gave pursuit, their heavy footfalls cracking the crystalline soil. They moved through the undergrowth without resistance, ancient trees splintering as they passed. Kalen's tech savvy became their only edge. He pulled a small device from his belt, a scanner he'd salvaged from his ship. It couldn't read the sentinels, but it mapped the terrain ahead, highlighting unstable ground, fissures too narrow for the stone giants to follow. "Left," he shouted, his voice sharp over the sound of splintering trees. Seren veered, trusting the command without question. Her knowledge of Shaolanka supplied the rest. She led them into a narrow canyon, its walls streaked with veins of soft, unstable mineral. The sentinels followed, their broad shoulders scraping against the rock. Seren pointed to a precariously balanced rock column near the top of the gorge. Kalen understood. He fired his last energy cartridge at its base. The column sheared away, crashing down in a cloud of dust and stone, blocking the passage behind them. They didn't stop running until the sounds of pursuit faded. They leaned against the cold canyon wall, breathing hard. The immediate threat was gone, but the realization remained. Their personal conflict, their mutual suspicion, felt small now, irrelevant. They were up against something that made corporate intrigue and personal vengeance look like children's games. The sword had not just been a key, it was a beacon. It had awakened guardians that had slept for centuries, maybe millennia. The Drexel were just the latest problem on a world that had seen far worse. Kalen looked at the dormant blade in his hand. It had saved them by showing him the terrain, but it had also doomed them by calling the sentinels. It was a balance of risk and reward he was only beginning to understand. Seren watched him, her expression unreadable. Her solitary mission was no longer solitary. His corporate betrayal was no longer just about profit. They were caught in a current much larger than themselves. Survival was no longer a personal goal. It was a shared necessity. The path to the Citadel was now lined with dangers neither of them had anticipated. They would have to watch each other's backs not out of trust, but because the alternative was certain death. The alliance was temporary. The stakes were permanent. Kalen held the sword out flat on his palms. The blue light along its blade pulsed slowly like a resting heartbeat. "It talks to me," he said. "Not with words. With images, feelings. It showed me star charts. The way here, the Drexel facility." He watched her face, expecting disbelief, maybe derision. Serene did not reach for the weapon. She kept her distance, her eyes narrowed. "My elders spoke of such things. They called them cursed objects. Tools that think for themselves. They said to leave them buried." Her voice was flat, but her hand rested on the hilt of her own blade. "A precaution. That is not technology. It is dangerous magic. It twists the will." He understood then. It was a divide not of intelligence, but of culture. His world ran on circuits and code. Hers ran on tradition and warning tales. To him, the sword was a puzzle to be solved. To her, it was a corruption to be feared. "It's not magic," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure anymore. "It's just tech so advanced we can't tell the difference." To prove his point, he closed his eyes and let his mind go still. He focused on a simple question. "Show me the nearest source of fresh water." The sword warmed in his hands. A complex image formed behind his eyelids. A topographical map of the surrounding area. A glowing path leading to an underground spring he had no way of knowing existed. He opened his eyes and pointed northeast. Water, 1/2 kilometer that way. Behind a rockfall, Serene's expression shifted. The rigid suspicion softened into something more thoughtful. "The old stories," she said slowly. "They tell of the first ones. They could speak to stone. Make metal breathe. Their tools were alive. We thought they were just tales to scare children." She looked from the sword to the ancient ruins around them. "Your technology, it sounds like there's sorcery." The distinction began to crumble for both of them. The sword was a piece of a forgotten world. A civilization so advanced its creation seemed supernatural. Its sentience wasn't demonic. It was engineered. It had a purpose, a logic they were only starting to grasp. This realization reframed everything. They began to see the Drexel operations through this new blended lens. The Citadel wasn't just a prison. It was a place where this old technology was being exploited. The experiments on the children, the fusion of flesh and machine, it wasn't random cruelty. It was a brutal, crude attempt to harness a power they didn't understand. They were trying to force a key into a lock it wasn't meant to fit. A common understanding settled between them, built not on agreement, but on shared evidence. Their worldviews, once so opposed, began to converge on the same impossible truth. The universe was stranger than either had believed. Science and sorcery were just different words for forces beyond their current comprehension. The sword was the proof. It was a guide, a weapon, and a teacher all in one. They stopped seeing each other as a corporate thief and a superstitious warrior. They became two people staring at the same profound mystery from different angles. The shared experience with the impossible forged a fragile bridge. It was no longer about convincing the other. It was about facing the truth together. The path ahead was still dark, but now they had a single light to follow. The sword's visions were not random. They were a guided tour through a specific kind of hell. Kalen saw it all. The images burned into his mind with clinical clarity. Rows of children, their small bodies restrained on cold tables. Tubes fed into their arms. Monitors displayed lines of data he couldn't read, but their meaning was horrifyingly clear. This wasn't about taking prisoners for labor. This was science, cold and brutal. The Drexel weren't just raiders. They were experimenters on an industrial scale. The children were selected, not captured. They were sorted by genetic markers he didn't understand. The sword highlighted one specific sequence, a particular adaptability common to Seren's people. The Laran. Their bodies could withstand environmental stresses that would kill others. Their nervous systems processed information differently, faster. The Drexel wanted that. They weren't just stealing children. They were harvesting biological material. The aim was a hybrid, a new warrior. The strength and aggression of the Drexel fused with the resilient adaptive biology of the Laran. It was a sickening form of eugenics, a breeding program that used living children as its raw ingredients. The vision shifted. He saw a child, a girl with dark hair and a familiar silver streak, being led toward a machine that pulsed with the same blue energy as his sword. The machine wasn't for containment. It was for transformation. Seren watched his face as the visions took him. She saw the color drain from his skin. She saw his hands tighten on the sword's hilt. When he spoke, his voice was low and hollow. He told her what he saw. He described the machines, the tubes, the cold efficiency of it all. He told her they weren't just holding her daughter. They were altering her. The truth hit Seren like a physical blow. Her daughter wasn't valuable for ransom or as a slave. She was valuable for her blood, for her DNA. She was a component. The empty village, the targeted attack, the elders' cold condemnation, it all snapped into a new, terrible focus. Her failure wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a delivery. She had handed them the perfect specimen. They had known Morgra was a warlord. They hadn't understood he was a farmer. He cultivated children like a crop, weeding out the incompatible, nurturing the ones with the right traits. His citadel wasn't a fortress. It was a laboratory, a nursery, a factory for a new kind of soldier. The scale of it was chilling. This wasn't about conquering a single world. It was about building an army to conquer a galaxy. Their mission fractured and then reformed, harder and more urgent than before. It was no longer just about one child. It was about every child on those tables. It was about stopping the production line. A personal rescue was not enough. They had to break the machine. They had to burn the entire operation to the ground. The weight of it settled on them, a shared burden of terrible understanding. They weren't just trying to get a little girl back. They were trying to prevent the birth of an entire army of monsters. The path ahead was darker than they had imagined, but their purpose was now absolute. The air inside the citadel was the first truth. It smelled of chemicals, of ozone and sterile cleansers, but underneath that, a thicker scent lingered. Blood. And something else. Something sweet and rotten, like spoiled meat. The hum of machinery was constant, a low vibration through the metal floor. But through it, other sounds reached them. A low moan from a closed door. The choked sob of a child. The clinical click of a lock engaging. It was a place of organized suffering. The maintenance tunnel emptied into a larger corridor. Kalen's scanner showed them the way, avoiding patrols. The beings they saw now were not Drexel. They were taller, their movements stiff, jerky. Cybernetic limbs replaced flesh. Their surfaces a patchwork of metal and grafted skin. Their eyes glowed with a dull red light. They did not speak. They moved in perfect unison, their heads scanning on a fixed pattern. Twilight Guardians. The name came to Kalen from the sword's whispers. They were the enforcers here, the perfect jailers. They found a room that was not locked. It was a disposal chamber. Metal bins lined the walls, overflowing with refuse. But this was not food waste or packaging. It was biological, limbs that ended in crude cybernetic ports, small bodies wrapped in stained sheets, containers filled with a pale, viscous fluid that held unrecognizable shapes. The scale of it was staggering. This was not a handful of failed experiments. This was systematic production, with waste management to match. The numbers were industrial. Seren moved through the room like she was in a trance. Her eyes scanned the horror, but her focus was absolute. She was looking for one thing. One person. Her hand brushed against a small cart filled with personal effects taken from new arrivals. A small wooden toy. A torn piece of cloth with familiar embroidery. And there, half hidden under a stained rag, a small silver pendant, its chain broken. She picked it up. Her fingers traced the familiar engraving. It was cold. The clasp was bent, forced open. The lock of her daughter's hair was gone. Kalen watched her, then turned his attention to the machinery in the room. A console monitored the disposal process. The technology was advanced, but he recognized the design principles. The energy signatures. This was Vantrek's research. Not just similar, the same. The schematics on the screen mirrored files he'd been paid to steal months ago. The corporation wasn't just aware of this. They were partners. Their forbidden projects hadn't been halted. They had been moved here, scaled up, and handed to a warlord with no ethical limits. They moved on, the silence between them heavier than before. The corridors became cleaner, more sterile. The rooms they passed now had large observation windows. Inside, they saw children on tables. Tubes ran into their arms. Machines hovered over them, injecting fluids, making precise incisions. The children's eyes were open, but they saw nothing. The process was calm, efficient. There was no rage here, no chaotic evil, just a terrible, focused purpose. They were on an assembly line. They finally understood. The targeting of children, the specific age range. It wasn't about slavery or ransom. It was about raw material. Young bodies were more adaptable. Their systems could be rewritten, fused with technology before their biology resisted. They were the perfect clay for Morgra's new army. The personal tragedy of a missing daughter was a single data point in a vast, horrific calculation. The rescue mission was now a reckoning. They were not just fighting for one life. They were walking into the heart of a machine built to consume thousands. They found him in the central control spire. It was not a throne room. It was a laboratory. Morgra stood before a massive bank of screens displaying genetic sequences and real-time vitals from the chambers below. He was not the warlord they expected. His body was a map of enhancements, metallic limbs that moved with hydraulic precision, a spine reinforced with cabling that pulsed with blue energy, one eye replaced by a glowing red lens that continuously scanned data. He was more machine than Drexel, a fusion of flesh and technology that was both powerful and grotesque. He did not turn when they entered. He was studying a screen showing a child's physiological readouts. He spoke without looking up. His voice was layered, a natural tone undercut by a synthetic buzz. He explained his work with the calm precision of a farmer discussing crop rotation. The children were not prisoners. They were raw material. The future required a stronger foundation. The Drexel possessed martial might, but they were brittle, prone to genetic decay. The Laren had resilience, a cellular flexibility that could be harnessed. The goal was a perfect fusion. A new generation of warriors free from the weaknesses of their parent species. He called it an evolutionary necessity, a step forward for all. He gestured to a screen showing a young girl connected to an array of tubes and wires. Her body was accepting the cybernetic graphs at an accelerated rate. He pointed out her Laran genetic markers with clinical pride. She represented the ideal. The process was not without waste, of course. Some specimens failed to integrate, but the successful ones would be the first of their kind. The foundation of a new order. Parents were relics, he said. Sentimental attachments that hindered progress. They clung to the old forms, the flawed biology. They were obstacles to be removed. His ambition was not conquest in the old sense. It was replacement. He was building the army that would not just defeat its enemies, but render them obsolete. The scale of it was staggering. This was not about one world or one war. It was about rewriting the future of multiple species. His vision was cold, logical, and utterly horrifying. He believed he was a creator, architect of a better tomorrow. The suffering, the loss, the countless broken children, these were just the necessary byproducts of progress. Seren listened, her hand tight on her sword. The personal agony of her lost daughter was suddenly dwarfed by the monstrous scale of this ambition. Her child was not just a victim. She was a data point, a potential component in a vast, inhuman design. The rescue was no longer just a mother's desperate act. It was a strike against an ideology that saw living beings as resources to be processed. Kalen watched the screens, the cold data reflecting in his eyes. His corporate betrayals, his life as a thief felt small and clean compared to this. This was an evil built on spreadsheets and genetic maps. They had come for one child. They now faced a system designed to consume thousands. The man before them was not a simple monster to be slain. He was a belief system made flesh and metal. Stopping him would require more than force. It would require breaking his entire vision at its root. The personal had become planetary. The rescue mission was now a crusade. They stood in the heart of the machine, and they understood that simply pulling one piece free would not be enough. They would have to shatter the mechanism itself. The landscape beyond the blue forest was a map of pain. Jagged volcanic rock sliced at their boots. Shifting crystalline sands swallowed their steps, making every movement an effort. Geothermal vents hissed, releasing foul-smelling vapors that burned the lungs. Serene led them along ridges and through narrow canyons, her eyes constantly scanning for the best path, the safest footing. Kalen followed, his scanner mapping thermal pockets and unstable ground. The sword on his back hummed softly, its pulse a constant guide through terrain that seemed actively hostile. Drexel patrols were a near-constant threat. They moved in tight, efficient patterns, their repulsor craft skimming just above the sharp rock formations. Seren and Kalen spent more time hiding than moving. They pressed into narrow fissures, lay flat on hot stone as search patterns swept overhead. Each delay ate at Seren's resolve. Each near miss tightened the knot in Kalen's stomach. The citadel grew slowly larger on the horizon, a dark blot against the sky, its presence a taunt. Their skills began to dovetail out of necessity. Seren's strategic mind identified patrol rotations and safe paths. Kalen's tech picked up energy signatures and ground stability readings she could never see. The sword showed them routes that looked impassable, a sheer cliff face with hidden handholds, a field of bubbling pools with a narrow safe passage. They had no choice but to trust it. They had no choice but to trust each other. The cooperation was forced, and it showed. When a pack of six-legged ursine creatures attacked from a thicket of sharp thorns, Seren engaged the alpha directly. Her blade was a blur, precise and brutal. She killed it, but not before its claws opened deep gashes across her back. Kalen used a sonic emitter from his pack to disorient the others, driving them back. They didn't speak. He handed her a clotting agent from his medkit. She took it with a stiff nod, turning her back to him to apply it herself. The silence was heavy, but the assistance was given and accepted. Later, it was Kalen who faltered. Reaching for a handhold on a sharp volcanic face, his palm came down on a growth of crystalline flora. The translucent spines drove deep into his flesh. He hissed in pain, his grip slipping. Seren above him didn't hesitate. She anchored herself and reached down, hauling him up by the strap of his pack. At the next resting point, she took his hand without asking. Her fingers were calloused but quick. She used the point of her knife to carefully extract the spines, then applied an antiseptic paste from her own meager supplies. Her touch was clinical, efficient. It wasn't gentle, but it was thorough. They didn't thank each other. Gratitude felt too large for the small, grim space between them. But a shift had occurred. The shared suffering, the constant reliance was carving away their suspicion. They began to anticipate each other's movements. A silent signal from Seren would make Kalen freeze. A low warning from his scanner had her drawing her blade without question. They were learning each other's rhythms, the unspoken language of survival. The land itself seemed to respect their persistence. The sharp rock gave way to a high plateau. The air, though still thin, was cleaner. The citadel stood fully revealed now, a monstrous construction of dark metal and stone built into the cliff face itself. It was no longer a distant smudge. It was a reality. They stood for a moment side by side, looking at it. The journey had tested every limit they had. It had also forged a bond they hadn't wanted, but now could not do without. Respect was not friendship. It was harder. It was earned. They turned from the view and began the final approach. Together. From their vantage point, the citadel looked like a single solid piece of metal and rock. No obvious gates, no weak points in the outer wall. Energy fields shimmered over possible entry points. Sensor arrays swept the approach every 37 seconds. A direct assault would be suicide. They would be cut down before they got within 50 meters. Force was not an option. Stealth and intelligence were their only tools. Kalen's salvage scanner was their first advantage. It couldn't penetrate the main walls, but it mapped energy flow. He traced the massive power conduits that fed the internal systems. He found the secondary networks, the life support, the climate control, the waste disposal. All of it had to be maintained. Every system had access points. He identified a series of large ventilation shafts on the Citadel's eastern flank, where the geothermal activity from the mountain met the structure's cooling needs. The shafts were wide, shielded from primary sensors, and led deep into the lower levels. It was a vulnerability, an oversight in their otherwise perfect defense. Seren's contribution was timing. She had watched the patrols for 2 full cycles. The Drexel were disciplined, but they were creatures of habit. Their shifts changed at precise intervals. There was a 90-second window, right after one patrol passed the eastern thermal vents and before the next one arrived, where the area was completely unobserved. It was a small gap. It would have to be enough. She calculated the approach, the points where they would need to move quickly, where they could pause. Her mind worked like a tactician's, seeing the patterns in the enemy's movement. Their plan took shape on the dusty ground, drawn with a stick. They would use the cover of a geothermal steam vent to mask their thermal signatures for the final approach. They would climb the rock face next to the main vent, using the natural handholds and fissures. Saren would craft ropes from the tough, fibrous vines that grew in the shadows. Kalen would use volcanic rock to fashion crude but effective grappling hooks. They would enter through a maintenance grate he had identified on the scanner, a point where the shielding was weakest. The entire operation hinged on precision. 90 seconds of exposed movement. A silent climb, a near impossible breach of the grate without triggering internal alarms. Then navigation through unmarked service tunnels deep inside the enemy's stronghold. There was no margin for error. A single misstep, a single sound at the wrong time, and it would all be over. They would be surrounded, outnumbered, and killed. This was their only chance. They both knew it. There would be no second attempt. The stakes erased the last traces of their temporary alliance. This was no longer about convenience or shared danger. It was about absolute reliance. Serene had to trust that Kalen's tech would blind the sensors for exactly long enough. Kalen had to trust that Seren's count of the patrol rotations was perfect. Their lives and the lives of the children depended on each other's skills being flawless. The resentment, the cultural suspicion, the history of working alone, it all fell away. What remained was a cold, clear understanding. They were partners. The strategy, born from desperate necessity, had forged the first true thing between them. It was not friendship. It was something harder and more reliable. Mutual certainty in the other's ability to not get them killed. They looked at each other, then back at the Citadel. The plan was set. Kalen drove the blade into the slot. The metal met no resistance. It slid home like it was returning to a sheath it had known for centuries. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the blue light that lived in the sword's veins bled out. It poured into the machine, a river of energy flooding the dark channels of the core. The hum that had been Kalen's constant companion rose to a single high-pitched tone. Then it stopped. The sword shattered. It did not break. It disintegrated, turning to fine, glittering dust that hung in the air for a second before vanishing. Its power was gone, given away all at once. The effect was instantaneous. The blue light did not fade. It flared, a silent explosion of energy that washed through the chamber. It passed through the walls, the machinery, the people. The Twilight Guardians froze mid-stride. The red light in their eyes flickered and died. Then they collapsed. They did not fall like living things. They dropped like puppets with their strings cut, a cacophony of metal and flesh hitting the floor. The control that had animated them was severed. They were just empty shells again. In the transformation bays, the surge hit the children. Those in the early stages of the process cried out as the machinery attached to them spasmed and died. The tubes retracted. The needles withdrew. For those further along, the change was more violent. Beings that were more machine than child seized as the foreign energy in their bodies destabilized. Some did not survive the shock. Their enhanced bodies could not handle the sudden loss of the system that sustained them. Others writhed on the tables, their cybernetic implants fading, the metallic sheen on their skin receding like a tide pulling back. The process was unwinding itself. Seren was already moving. She ignored Morgra, who stood stunned by the energy wave. She ran to the pod the sword had shown her. The lid was already retracting, the mechanisms dead. Inside, a small girl lay still. Wires were fused to her temples, and a lattice of fine metallic threads ran under her skin across her chest and arms. As Serene watched, the blue energy of the surge washed over her daughter. The metal implants glowed white-hot for a second, then began to dissolve. They didn't melt. They sublimated, turning to smoke that left behind unmarked skin. The light in the child's eyes, which had been a dull, artificial blue, faded to her natural brown. She gasped a raw human sound. The transformation was broken. The citadel itself began to die. The deep thrum of power that had vibrated through the floor ceased. Lights flickered and went out. Emergency systems failed to activate. From deep within the mountain, a groan echoed. The sound of ancient stone settling without its technological supports. Chunks of rock and metal began to shear from the ceiling, crashing down onto the silent machinery. Morgra's regime, built entirely on this borrowed, brutalized technology, was collapsing with it. His enhancements, his army, his grand design, all of it was tied to the core. And the core was gone. The sacrifice was total. The weapon that had been their guide, their protector, their key, was utterly destroyed. Its power had been the lock and the key, and the only thing that could break the system for good. Force could not have done this. Stealth could not have done this. Only this exact act, this precise offering, could achieve it. They had traded their greatest advantage for a chance to break the chains. The cost was measured in more than blood. It was measured in the silent hum of a faithful blade now gone forever. But the chains were broken. The citadel groaned around them, a dying beast. Stone and metal shrieked as supports gave way. Serene held her daughter close, the child's small body pressed against her chest. They ran through crumbling corridors, following the path of their initial infiltration. Kalen led the way, his scanner picking the safest route through the collapsing structure. The air was thick with dust and the smell of ozone from failing systems. They burst out onto the mountainside just as a large section of the outer wall sheared away and crashed into the ravine below. The sky was a deep twilight purple. The immediate danger was behind them. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by their ragged breathing and the distant rumble of the mountain settling. Elra stirred in her mother's arms. The physical signs of the transformation were gone, but other marks remained. Her eyes, once a bright, curious brown, now held a distant, haunted look. She flinched at sudden movements. When she tried to speak, her voice was a raspy whisper, as if her throat had been damaged by the tubes. She did not cry. She just stared, her small fingers gripping Serene's tunic with a strength that was unsettling. The relief of the rescue was already being tempered by a colder, sharper fear. What had they done to her? What lasting damage lay beneath the surface? Kalen watched them, his own loss a quiet weight. The sword was gone. His hand felt empty without its familiar hum. He saw the fear in Serene's eyes as she looked at her daughter. He knew that look. It was the fear of a problem you couldn't fight with a blade. "This world doesn't have what she needs," he said, his voice low. The Drexel scraped their tech together from stolen pieces. The real knowledge, the advanced medicine, it's out there. On core worlds, in places Vantrex would rather keep hidden. He wasn't offering comfort. He was stating a tactical fact. The next objective was clear. They needed better resources. Their victory against Morgra felt small now. They had broken one machine, but the blueprint for it existed elsewhere. Kalen had seen the Vantrex files. The corporation's logo was stamped on schematics identical to the Citadel's machinery. This wasn't a Drexel project. It was a corporate one, outsourced to a brutal partner. Morgra was a contractor, not the architect. The real threat was still out there in clean, sterile boardrooms light years away. Their success here had only revealed the true size of the enemy. They stood on the edge of the crystal sea as the twin suns set. Serene looked from her daughter's pale face to Kalen's determined one. Her solitary quest was over. A new one was beginning. His tech-savvy and off-world knowledge complemented her combat skill and survival instinct. They were a match set, a unit, an oath formed between them, unspoken but absolute. They would find a way to heal Elra. They would find the best medtech in the galaxy. And then, they would find the people who had built that machine. The personal mission had expanded. It was no longer about one child or one warlord. It was about the network that made them possible. The fight had just gotten bigger. Their partnership was the only thing that made it possible to wage. The ship screamed. Kalen braced as atmosphere tore at the hull, the sound like a dying animal. Instruments flashed red, then died completely. Navigation, communications, life support all gone dark. The sword in his hand grew warm, then hot. It pulled, a physical tug toward the planet's surface. He felt the ship's trajectory shift. No longer a random plummet, but a guided descent. He wasn't flying. He was being flown. The impact threw him forward. Restraints bit into his shoulders. Metal groaned and twisted. Then silence. He sat in the dim cockpit, listening to the hiss of escaping air and the creak of cooling metal. The viewport was webbed with cracks, but through them, he saw a forest of impossible blue, trees with leaves the color of deep ocean, trunks wrapped in silver bark that glinted in the strange light. He forced the cockpit open. The air hit him first, thin cold, carrying the scent of ozone and something sweet like crushed blossoms. He climbed out, his boots sinking into soil that glittered with tiny crystal shards. In the distance, a vast sea of crystalline water reflected twin suns, its surface utterly still. To the north, plumes of geothermal steam rose from fissures in the earth, painting the sky with faint colors. The beauty was unnerving. It felt like a trap. He didn't have long to look. The low hum of repulsor engines cut through the quiet. Drexel patrol craft, 3 of them, moving in a search pattern above the tree line. They weren't roaming. They were scanning, methodical, their path directly toward his crash site. They had known he was coming. They were waiting. The sword pulsed in his grip. A new vision flooded his mind, sharper than before. A citadel carved into a mountainside, its architecture angular and severe. Inside its heart, rows of containment pods. Children, their faces still, their bodies connected to pulsing machinery. He saw the young girl from the Vantrex files, the one with the distinctive silver streak in her hair. Saren's daughter. The image was so clear it felt like memory. The sword was showing him the destination. It was also showing him the reason. He understood then. This wasn't a coincidence. His theft, the crash, the patrols, it was all connected. He was a piece on a board, moved into position by a hand he couldn't see. The corporate fugitive was gone. In his place stood a man with a purpose he hadn't chosen, but would have to fulfill. He was a stranger on an alien world, holding a key to a lock he'd never seen. Somewhere in those blue forests, another moved with a different kind of purpose, a warrior driven by a loss as deep as his new burden. Their paths had been converging long before today. Now they shared the same ground, the same danger, the same impossible mission. The sword had brought him here for a collision. It was only a matter of time. Saren moved through the blue forests of Shaolanka like a ghost. Every step felt measured, deliberate, a further payment on a debt she could never clear. Her pack held little. Dried rations for 3 more days, a water filter, a field knife. Her sword rested against her back, its familiar weight a cold comfort. The air here was thin and carried a sharp mineral scent. But all she could smell was the smoke of her village. All she could see were the empty spaces where children should have been. Each time her boot sank into the crystalline soil, she remembered the feel of ash under her feet. Each time the wind sighed through the silver-barked trees, it sounded like a child's whisper. Her daughter's name echoed in her mind with a rhythm as steady as her heartbeat. Elra. The pendant around her neck felt heavy, a small silver locket holding a single lock of her child's hair. On the worst nights, when the cold bit deep and despair circled, she would open it and run her thumb over the soft strands. It was the only thing that kept the numbness at bay. Drexel patrols were a constant threat. She heard their repulsor engines long before she saw them. A low hum that set her teeth on edge. She would freeze, melt into the shadow of a tree or drop into a narrow fissure, holding her breath until they passed. Their patrol patterns were efficient, covering ground in a methodical sweep. She was always having to detour, adding hours, sometimes days, to her journey. Every delay was a fresh cut. Every hidden moment was a reminder of her powerlessness. Her body ached. Hunger was a familiar hollow in her stomach. Thirst made her head light. She slept in short, alert bursts, curled in rocky crevices or high in the branches of the alien trees. Her muscles were tight with constant tension, but the physical strain was nothing compared to the weight in her chest. The guilt was a companion more constant than any shadow. She had been on patrol when they came. She had not been there to stand at the gate with Kaelin. She had not been there to hold her daughter. The land itself seemed to resist her. She passed ruins that spoke of a civilization far older than the Drexel occupation. Stone arches carved with strange glyphs stood half buried in the blue moss. Fallen pillars exhibited a craftsmanship her people had never mastered. Once she found a courtyard where the ground was inlaid with a mosaic of stars and planets, their configurations unfamiliar. This world had secrets. The Drexel were not its first invaders. They were just the latest. Her isolation made her wary of everything. A shift in the light, a sudden silence among the indigenous fauna, the crack of a distant branch. Each potential sign of another presence made her hand go to her sword. Trust was a luxury she could not afford. Companionship was a risk that could get her killed. She was a single thread, stretched thin across a hostile landscape, and to entangle herself with another was to risk snapping entirely. She pushed on, through geothermal fields where the air shimmered with heat and the ground could crack open without warning, across plains of razor-edged grass that cut her hands as she pushed through, up sheer rock faces that left her muscles burning. The citadel was her only landmark, a dark smudge on the distant horizon growing slowly larger. It was a nightmare she was walking toward willingly. Her daughter was in there. That was the only fact that mattered. Her body could break, her spirit could fray, but she would not stop. A mother's love had become a weapon, and she would use it to tear that place apart. The sword hummed in Kalen's grip, a low, insistent vibration that traveled up his arm and settled in his mind. It wasn't guiding him anymore. It was acknowledging something. The patterns on the main control console pulsed with the same rhythm, the same blue light. He watched the energy flow from the sword's blade to the machine's core, a silent conversation happening just outside his perception. The sword hadn't been leading him to a fight. It had been leading him to a lock, and it was the key. He understood it then, the truth clicking into place with a finality that chilled him. The living sword was not just a weapon, it was the control mechanism, the central processor for the entire transformation system. Its power source, its very sentience, was a piece of the same ancient technology that had built the Guardians, the same force the Drexel were trying so brutally to harness. It was the original. Morgra's machinery was a crude, parasitic copy feeding off its energy signature. The sword's guidance, its unexplained choices, its pull to this specific point, it was all leading to this moment. The realization was a cold weight. To break Morgra's control, to shatter the system and free the children, the sword had to be sacrificed. It had to be physically united with the machine it was meant to command and then destroyed. The energy backlash would be catastrophic for the machinery. It would also mean losing their greatest advantage. The blade that had protected them, guided them, given them an edge against impossible odds would be gone. They would be left facing Morgra and his enhanced warriors with nothing but their own skills. Kalen looked at the weapon in his hands. Its gentle glow pulsed warm and alive. It had never felt like a tool. It had always felt like a partner. A silent, knowing companion on a path he never chose. He realized his entire journey, the theft from Vantrex, the crash on Shaolanka, the fight for survival, had been orchestrated. His destiny was not to wield the sword. It was to deliver it. He was the courier for its final fatal message. The weapon's sentience understood this. It had always understood. Its guidance was the preparation for its own end. He met Seren's eyes across the control room. She saw the understanding on his face. She saw the resignation. She had feared the sword's alien power, called it dangerous magic. Now she saw its true purpose and the cost of using it. Her hand tightened on the pendant at her neck, the empty locket that had once held her daughter's hair. This was the only way. The sword had to die so that Elra could live. The ancient technology, so advanced it seemed like sorcery, revealed its ultimate function not in creation but in destruction. It was a key that could only be used once to break the lock forever. Its final act would be a sacrifice. The plan was pure risk. It relied on perfect timing. They had to act as one, but separately. Serene's job was to engage Morgra directly. A frontal assault, pure suicide if done wrong. Her attack had to be a spectacle, a threat he couldn't ignore. Kalen's job was to get to the core. He had to use the chaos she created to move through the chamber and reach the central machinery. The sword had to be thrust into the heart of the system at the exact moment Morgra was fully committed to destroying Seren. Their success required a synchronization they had never practiced. They had one chance. Seren moved first. She did not shout. She simply stepped from the cover of the control consoles and leveled her blade at the warlord. Her stance was pure challenge. Morgra's enhanced red eye focused on her. dismissing Kalen as a lesser threat. He smiled, a cold stretch of metallic lips. He raised an arm and it shifted, the metal and flesh reforming into a massive serrated blade. He charged. The fight was instantaneous and brutal. Serene gave ground, her defense a blur of precise parries and evasions. She was not trying to win. She was trying to survive. She was the perfect distraction. As Morgra advanced, the Twilight Guardians reacted. They moved to protect their master, forming a wall between the fight and the core. This was the opening. Kalen broke from his hiding place, the living sword humming in his hand. He did not run toward the core. He moved along the periphery, using the raised platforms and energy conduits for cover. The Guardians, focused on the spectacle of their leader's combat, were slow to notice him. He was a shadow, a secondary concern. Their cooperation became seamless in the chaos. Without a word, without a signal, they understood the rhythm of the fight. When Seren fainted left, drawing a heavy swing from Morgra that left him momentarily overextended, Kalen used the second of diverted attention to cross an open space. When Kalen triggered a small energy surge from a console, creating a flash of light and sound, Seren used the momentary distraction to score a shallow cut on Morgra's armored shoulder. The small victory enraged him, locking his attention on her completely. They were two instruments playing a deadly duet, each note perfectly timed to the other. Morgra's enhanced capabilities made him a force of nature. He was faster than anything Seren had ever faced. His strength could shatter the reinforced floor with a missed strike. She was operating on pure instinct, her body moving on training and desperation. Every second she held his focus was a victory. Every near miss was a brush with death. The timing was everything. Kalen had to reach the core before her luck ran out. He finally made it. The central apparatus glowed with intense blue energy, a complex web of crystalline structures and pulsating conduits. The heart of the machine was a single dark opening, a slot that seemed to drink the light around it. Kalen knew this was the place. The sword in his hand trembled, its hum rising to a high, piercing frequency. It was ready. He looked across the chamber. Seren was on her knees, barely deflecting a blow that would have cut her in half. Morgra loomed over her, his weapon raised for a final strike. This was the moment. The only moment they would get. Seren stood on the ridge looking back at the smoldering ruin of the citadel. Her daughter slept fitfully against her shoulder. The silence was different now. It was not the isolating silence of her lone trek through the blue forests. This silence was shared. Kalen stood a few paces away, scanning the horizon with a detached focus, his hand occasionally flexing at his side where the sword's hilt used to be. She remembered the crushing weight of those first days after the attack, the absolute certainty that her path was one of solitary penance, that her strength had to be enough because it was all she had left. She had worn her isolation like armor, believing it was the only thing that would see her through. That belief now felt like a foreign country she had left behind. The evidence was undeniable. She had fought through hell alone, and it had brought her to the edge of failure. It was the arrival of another, an outsider with different skills and a different past that had turned the impossible into a chance. Their separate capabilities, once isolated, had interlocked. Her combat precision, his technical ingenuity, her knowledge of the land, his understanding of the enemy's machines. Alone, each was a partial tool. Together, they became a key. Kalen's transformation was just as complete. The corporate fugitive who had only looked out for his own survival was gone. In his place stood a man who had sacrificed his only valuable asset, his only edge, for a child he did not know and a cause he had not chosen. His journey had not been one of guilt but of purpose. The sword's guidance had been a bridge, connecting his self-interest to a fight much larger than himself. He was no longer running from something. He was moving toward something. The commitment was etched into the new stillness of his posture. The living weapon had been the catalyst, but the choice had been theirs. It had brought them to the same point in space and time, but it was their decision to fight back to back, to trust each other's motions in the dark, to plan an infiltration that required absolute synchronization, that had truly united them. The sword was a tool. Their partnership was the hand that wielded it. They had faced a nightmare built on control and division, and they had beaten it not with greater force, but with a unity the enemy could not comprehend. She understood now that true strength was not a solitary flame to be guarded. It was a forge, made hotter by the combination of different metals. Her solitary hell had been a necessary trial, but it was not the destination. The galaxy's threats were too vast, too interconnected for any one person to face them alone. Vantrex's corporate greed, the Drexel's brutal efficiency, the echo of ancient technologies, these were enemies that required a combined front. Their vow to continue, to find a cure and then confront the source was an acknowledgement of this new truth. Their personal goals had not vanished. They had simply been woven into a larger tapestry of shared purpose. Isolation had ended the moment they chose to see each other, not as obstacles, but as assets. It ended when a silent agreement passed between them on a battlefield, when a medkit was handed over without a word, when a path was chosen because the other suggested it. The journey ahead would be longer and more dangerous than the one behind, but it would not be walked alone. The road was shared now. The burden was lighter for it. The end of her isolation was not a loss of strength. It was the beginning of a different, greater kind. They stood together as the mountain settled behind them. A warrior, a thief, and a child marked by forces she could not understand. Their victory was a beginning, not an end. The path ahead held new battles, finding a cure, challenging a corporate empire, protecting others from the same fate. Their strength would not come from standing alone, but from standing together. The most powerful alliances are forged in shared purpose, not solitary struggle. Their journey continues, but they no longer walk in isolation. They move as one, toward a future they will shape together.